Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Biden is marshaling federal resources in an attempt to slow the spread of COVID-19 and warning the nation of a challenging winter.
I pledge to always be straight and give it just straight from the shoulder as President of the United States and tell the American people exactly where we are. So here it is. Experts say the COVID-19 cases will continue to rise in the weeks ahead in this winter. So we need to be ready.
The president outlined the administration's plans to counter the virus this winter in an afternoon briefing. Among the measures, family mobile vaccination clinics where all eligible family members can be vaccinated simultaneously, along with requiring insurance companies to cover the costs of at-home rapid COVID tests. Funding these measures has become a political bargaining chip, with Republican Senators Ted Cruz, Ron Johnson, and Mike Lee threatening to shut down the government unless payment for these moves is taken out of any budget plans. But House Speaker Nancy Pelosi isn't having any of it.
This is so silly. This is so silly that we have people who are anti-science, anti-vaccination, saying they're going to shut down government over that. And you're asking me, what's our message? Our message is that we have to respect governance and we have to respect science. We're not going to go for their anti-vaxxing, okay? So if you think that's how we're going to keep government open, forget that.
The White House is acknowledging their public safety efforts, often in the face of very real political consequences.
I think we've taken a number of steps that are not intended to be controversial or divisive, but still may be perceived that way. But our most important factor is what is going to be most effective, and that's what we really base our decisions on. But as you've seen over the past several months, we build on our steps, right? We've continued to add and make vaccines and boosters more available and accessible. Today's a good example of that. We continue to put in place additional travel restrictions, as we announcing today as well. So we will continue to evaluate and assess on a daily basis. If there are additional steps our health and medical team is recommending, we will consider those as well.
And while Republicans continue to fight against increased vaccination efforts and masking mandates, party leaders have not offered much in the way of ideas to deal with the rising rates of infection across the nation. Related to COVID and the most recent Omicron variant is potential financial fallout. The new Gallup poll shows almost half of Americans say inflation is directly impacting their households, causing some degree of financial hardship. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the current labor shortage and its impact on the supply chain is not all bad, as it's forcing employers to pay their workers more. For more, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe, Alayna, Treene, and David Drucker. Ed is a CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Alayna is a congressional correspondent for Axios. And David is a senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner. Welcome. It's good to have you all. Ed, let me start with you. So the Omicron variant seems to have the potential to knock the economy off track. Now, Delta was highly transmissible, but the U.S. was still able to make economic headway during that period. So why is the White House afraid this is different?
Well, first of all, the White House is pretty pleased with how the state of the economy generally right now in this regard. Unemployment plummeting, wages increasing, economic forecasters preparing once again to possibly modify the quarterly growth rate to as much as 8%. They see a bunch of other economic indicators, like people having more money in the bank in general. But they know that inflation, especially as that poll that you mentioned shows, is concerning to a lot of Americans. The supply chain issues that are unique to this pandemic and are still wreaking havoc on the economy and the general psyche of Americans and shoppers generally is a real problem, especially if this Omicron variant spreads into Asia or Asian countries where a lot of goods are produced, go into some kind of a lockdown or production slowdown yet again, which is part of what caused all this to begin with. So they're attempting to just demonstrate that they're on top of things. But here's the thing. We all are waiting for scientists to tell us over the course of the next probably 10 days, maybe a little longer, how deadly this is, whether and how it's evading existing vaccines, and all other similar concerns. And so while we wait, while the White House waits, while everyone around the world waits to sort of figure out how significant is this variant, they've got to demonstrate that they're doing things to prepare or to run through every potential eventuality. And so they're doing that now. And, we will see ultimately whether the economy takes a hit or not. But as you point out, the fact that it sustained itself over the course of the Delta variant surge gives the White House some optimism that perhaps everything will be all right.
Right. And we know, though, that sense of uncertainty is something the markets certainly don't like one bit, as we've seen. Ed, a handful of Republican lawmakers threatened to hold up funding the government over the president's vaccine mandate. What are their proposals to combat rising COVID cases?
Well, they've been less clear on that, but what they are trying to do is force the Biden administration to stop its federal mandates by essentially siphoning off any federal funding for any program or any mandate that exists or any agency that's implementing one, and just say, stop them. They're unpopular. They're clearly suffering through legal challenges in the courts. There's at least a dozen major challenges to the mandate that was put in place or that was going to be put in place by OSHA. And so just stop it. Here's the thing, though. There's only about maybe 15 to 20 Republican senators total who would be up for something like this. And so ultimately, there appears to be enough support in the Senate to probably get beyond this. The question will be, does it slow things down enough that the Senate can't get this passed by Friday night, and in essence, the government enters at least a partial shutdown over the weekend? Or can they speed things up and get it done by midnight Friday and allow the government to remain open? The fact that you have the White House, Democratic leadership, and at least Senate Republican leadership saying, we don't want to shut things down, we're going to keep them open. This is an understandable concern that you have, but a relief that you may have, but we're not going to allow it to hold things up. The next 36 hours or so really will probably determine, how serious this was, or if this was just sort of a, last-ditch attempt by a vocal minority in the Senate, at least, who are concerned and trying to stop those mandates.
So I want to dig into that a little bit more, David. I mean, what is the dynamic? So Ed touched on it there, but what is happening? Why is this next period so critical?
Well, look, I think part of this is the fact that when you look at the conservative base and Republican activists out in the country outside of Washington, they are the ones that are pushing Republicans on Capitol Hill to use the leverage that they have in terms of the votes that are required in the U.S. Senate to get this government funding bill across the finish line, to use it as leverage to try and force Democrats and President Biden to scrap the vaccine mandates. Now, number one, the Democrats and President Biden are not going to scrap the vaccine mandates. Number two, the shutdown gambits never work politically, ever. Whoever forces a shutdown always loses politically. It's why Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is opposed to using anything as leverage that involves a government shutdown to try and affect policy, and why the only government shutdown we will see, if we see one, is one that comes about because, as Ed was aptly describing, the clock runs out. We get to midnight on Friday, and they need to consider legislation for a couple more days. But we're not going to see anything like the extended shutdowns we saw in the Trump presidency and the Obama presidency or the Clinton presidency, because there's not enough support for it. But I would point out that where this is coming from in Republican circles is really something that has bubbled up from the grassroots on the Republican side, where lots of Republican voters, particularly in states with competitive congressional primaries, are all demanding that Republicans do something, anything, to try and force the president's hand on this. And of course, when you're a candidate for office, or when you're a House Republican in a safe district and you only look over your shoulder at a primary challenge, you respond to your voters.
Well, Alayna, Senate Republicans are also stalling the National Defense Authorization Act. Why, and where does that stand now?
Yes, they are. And I'm here in the Senate now. It's very dysfunctional this week as we see a lot of these deadlines come up and come due. The NDAA, they've been trying to pass this. I mean, even since prior to Thanksgiving, the Senate was hoping to have some sort of agreement on the annual defense bill. And right now, they're still in a gridlock. And the key reason here right now is an effort by Senator Marco Rubio. He wants to force action on an amendment that he has to deal with forced labor of the Uyghur Muslims. And it's a bit complicated, but essentially he's arguing that he wants it to be part of the NDAA. Senator Chuck Schumer and leadership is saying they can't do that in the Senate. They have to have the rules and procedural rules say that it has to originate in the House. And so they're trying to find some sort of agreement now rather than pushing it through the Senate process, which has been expected. There's talk now of having the 4 congressional leaders come together and try to find some sort of agreement on the NDAA that could start now potentially in the House and then come back to the Senate. We're still waiting on whether that's actually going to be the process, and things are still up in the air. But it's a very messy thing. And I think, the annual defense bill is something that needs to pass, and it needs to pass by the end of the year to fund the military. It's passed, for decades now on time. And so it's really a key stressor right now inside Senate and the House.
Ed, the vice president's office is facing more turnover. How is the White House explaining that?
Yeah, so Simone Sanders, a pretty well-known name and face in Biden world, or in the K-Hive, as they refer to the vice president's orbit, is stepping down in the coming days. This was anticipated, and I think what's happened here is there are a handful of people around her, especially in the communications and sort of media logistics space, which is a big part of running a president or vice presidential office, who had essentially said, I'm here for only about a year to help you set up. That may not have been the case with Sanders, but she is somebody who has this incredible presence and following and portfolio and ability to draw an audience that I think she understands and the White House certainly appreciates, that outside the White House she may even be able to help in bigger ways by being a voice box and being somebody who can speak on their behalf, help explain things with a little more freedom outside the confines of the administration. A handful of other people who are leaving, in some cases legitimately did say from the beginning of the year, we're only sticking around for a year to set you up. These are people who worked in the Obama administration, understood that she was coming in new to this entire world and needed the operation to be set up. And they may move on to other positions in the administration. We'll see. And our communications director left about 10 days ago now. And that one was perhaps the most unexpected at the time, even though she'd been privately telling people that she was only going to stick around for a year as well. Look, this happens. The fact, though, that it's happening, people work for an administration for maybe a year, 18 months, 2 years, because in that world, doing that kind of work, 2 years might as well be 4 or 5, given the intensity of it, the long hours, the bad pay, and the flack, certainly, that can come with that kind of a job. The problem for the vice president, of course, is how many minutes of time during Red and Blue have we spent over the past year talking about stumbles and concerns and, is she being properly utilized and what's up with the future of the vice president, and is she as effective as Joe Biden was for Barack Obama or Mike Pence for Donald Trump or Al Gore for Bill Clinton? And so here at the end of the year, it looks like they're all leaving a sinking ship. Maybe that's the case in some, but I think what people need to appreciate is those that step into these roles never really intend to stay that long. I mean, there was certainly plenty of turnover in the Trump years, a fair amount of it after the first 2 or 3 years of the Obama administration. And in this case, remember, a lot of these people were also involved in campaigns in 2019 and 2020, so they're looking for a break, and they may be looking to cash out. And, you can't fault them for that necessarily.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Ed, and I think one that maybe some folks may not realize, that kind of context that when we hear these stories, sometimes it can feel a little bit insidery and a bit like palace intrigue. But at the end of the day, these are people who have devoted a great deal of time and energy and resources towards serving. And so it is natural for these kinds of transitions in and out of the West Wing to happen. Alayna, the House January 6th committee has moved to hold former DOJ official Jeffrey Clark in contempt of Congress for defying his subpoena. What is the same and what's different about his situation as compared to Steve Bannon's?
Well, it is a bit different. So Jeffrey Clark, former Justice Department official under the Trump administration, has not been complying with the January 6th committee. However, once they moved to hold him in contempt this week and decided that they would move forward, the committee would, with this. Jeffrey Clark's lawyer reached out to the committee and said he is willing to comply, but it's also in his right to exercise his Fifth Amendment right. And so what's going to happen now is the committee is still processing that contempt charge and does plan to move forward with it and bring it to a full House vote, depending on whether or not he does return and comply. But he's expected to come back and give some of those answers on the record to the committee, and that's what they're hoping for. And the different members on the committee have said that if he does answer in a way that they deem satisfactory and not really just being dismissive of the questions that they have, they will halt the contempt charges and hold on moving that forward. But I think the case here that's just really interesting is how committed they are to following through with their promises of contempt charges. And, we saw stonewalling all throughout the Trump administration when they would have these types of hearings and trying to exert executive privilege, and a lot of them be held up because it was a Trump Justice Department. And now we're seeing some of that accountability really take place. And we've also seen former President's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, is actually complying now with the committee after initially not initially kind of stonewalling them as well. And so I think that'll be interesting, too, to follow how far he'll go in that cooperation.
Yeah, that will be fascinating to watch. David, the U.S. is set to restart the Remain in Mexico program for asylum seekers. This is a controversial Trump-era policy, but with some changes. What are those?
Well, look, I think ultimately you have to look at the politics of this, right? Because the administration was resisting the Remain in Mexico policy precisely because it angered so many Democrats, and because the former president received so much flack for how he handled immigration security policy at the southern border. But what the new administration found is that you take away a lot of the security measures that Trump had implemented, and they ended up with a different sort of problem because people flock to the United States. They come for a better life. They come because of authoritarian regimes in their home countries. And the American people did not like images of chaos at the southern border or of a porous southern border. On top of it, the administration had to deal with the dichotomy in its message regarding the coronavirus, because on the one hand, the president is doing everything he can to reduce infection rates and try and make sure Americans can get back to normal. But we've had people cross the border. We don't know if they're vaccinated or not. And it's unclear what the policy is in terms of their ability to remain here unvaccinated. And I think you've seen in polling, it really put a dent in the president's approval numbers. And it hasn't done Vice President Harris any favors either, given that she was sort of put in charge of this immigration problem. And so I think this is a move the administration is making reluctantly, but realizes that the moves it made to sort of restart a more compassionate approach to how we treat illegal border crossers and people seeking asylum simply wasn't palatable enough to enough of the American people, and particularly not in these regions along the border in Texas and Arizona, where they experience it at a deeper level more than anybody else. Even in 2020, we saw some counties along the Mexican border in Texas vote for Donald Trump. They had not voted Republican for president in a century. And the former president's numbers and the Republican Party's numbers have gone up with Hispanics. And even though the administration may not have made all of these political calculations in this move, I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that they realized that the policy that they had pushed ahead with after taking office simply wasn't working.
Finally, Alayna, what are some of the political consequences that could play out in the midterms should the Supreme Court overturn Roe versus Wade?
Well, I mean, I think the fact that we're even discussing it is pretty remarkable. We knew when former President Trump had installed 3 really conservative justices to the court that this could become an issue, and we're seeing that now. And I think, what's very different about this Mississippi case from the Texas law that we saw last month is that what happens with that case, like you said, really could have an effect on abortion rights and Roe v. Wade, and in a way that we haven't seen the courts rule in a way in many years now. And so the political implications are huge. At one end of the spectrum is Republicans are really, especially those who are very pro-life, jazzed about this ruling, excited to have the courts take another look at Roe v. Wade and potentially have real action here, like I said, for the first time in several years. But at the same time, there are also potentially negative impacts. I've talked to some Republican strategists and lawmakers, and there are concerns that in certain areas of the country, particularly in affluent areas with suburban women, a target audience that the Republicans have always struggled with, there could be some trouble there on abortion rights and how this ruling goes. And so I think everyone is really eager to see what happens. We don't know when this ruling is going to, come through and be completed with the Supreme Court, but it definitely can have major implications for the midterms.
All right, Ed O'Keefe, Alayna, Treene, and David Drucker. I feel like we've covered the gambit of political issues on this Red and Blue Friday, or Thursday, as others call it. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.